So, Chuck, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, Jason.
So, Chuck, you were a squadron leader in the Navy SEALs, SEAL Team 6, and you've spent this entire war very carefully following what is happening. And I'd like to ask you, I've noticed something recently, which is that the Ukrainians seem to be doing everything they can to not allow the Russians, to deny the Russians, the ability to fight a war of attrition. Simply, the math doesn't work out to do that. There's a lot more Russians than there are Ukrainians. And that's why today they're doing things such as attacking the Russian units when they're preparing to assault. They're hitting them with drones or hitting them with HIMARS, but they're also hitting the Russian supplies. And even they're denying Russia's ability to fight the war by attacking inside of Russia, something that has shocked the Russian population. They're striking not only military bases, but also the manufacturing, which means that Russia will not physically have the parts or the supplies that they need. And this is a totally different way to prevent Russia from having the type of war that it'd like to have. Because a war of attrition only helps Russia. It cannot help Ukraine. But in return, the Ukrainians simply are not trying to maintain all of the territory right now. They're prioritizing saving their soldiers' lives and living the fight another day, knowing that taking down Putin's ability to wage war is really the strategic gain that they can have. Something that's much more than the gain that the Russians have by taking some more abandoned farmland in eastern Ukraine. But what have you noticed?
Well, exactly that. The Ukrainians, they cannot outfight the Russians per se. And the Ukrainians have never engaged in a peer-on-peer battle. For example, a Russian battalion deploys, it will generally not be attacked by a similar force, meeting it head on. And the Ukrainians have been very careful to do what the SEALs do. You pick your fights very carefully, fight only when and where you can win, and also don't fight the enemy where he's prepared to fight or where he wants to fight. Find what's most critical to the enemy and strike that. So deep in the Urals, where a computer chip company is working, the Ukrainians will strike that. The one factory that Russia had to produce fiber optic cable, the Ukrainians will strike that. So you can spool that. Those are strategic efforts. Now you come right down to the battlefield. Again, the Ukrainians are fighting asymmetrically, but also, you know, they have to fight with limited resources. So I'm a field commander for an area of operations in the Ukrainian army. I'm going to have to let the Russians win in certain places. So I want to make sure that if the Russians are going to take terrain, it's going to be on the floor of a valley. I'm going to give them a piece of swampland. I'm going to give them a piece of wide open agricultural area where there is no overhead cover. So again, the Russians are making some advances this summer. We'll talk about how and where that's happening here in a minute. But in general, Ukraine is sticking to their script, the asymmetrical war script, and they're dictating the music to the Russians who don't necessarily like it.
Well, how much land have the Russians taken this summer? The Russians have promised this would be a huge offensive with big results. What are we seeing actually play out?
Well, the Russians are banging the drum, and their fanboys point out that the Russians have taken 420 square kilometers this summer. Let's call this summer the beginning of May. The Russians lose 1,000 people every day, a full battalion ground up and disappeared every single day, 7 days of the week. Here we are at the end of June. They've lost 60,000 people in the last 2 months, and they've captured an area, 420 square kilometers, the size of Phoenix, Arizona. That's not winning the war. They've lost as many people as the United States lost in 10 years in Vietnam, and they've captured Phoenix, Arizona. And here's the other thing, they haven't captured a city. They didn't capture Phoenix. They captured this narrow, tiny 1 kilometer here over the entire 700 or 800 kilometers of the battle space. It isn't working, Jason, and the Russians have to know that as well.
Well, the Russians certainly seem that they're lost to what's going on. And that's why I've seemed to notice that recently morale seems to be getting worse within Russia itself. the people in Russia are nervous, they're unsettled by what's happening, and even Vladimir Putin has been quite uncharacteristically visibly nervous when speaking publicly in the past couple of weeks. In fact, in 20 years of following Putin, I don't remember him even once behaving like this. Multiple days in a row, he started to stutter as he was describing the situation with the economy, and he's been sort of unclear about what the future of the war is, saying they need a buffer zone with the Ukrainians, hence they were going to go into Sumy, Ukraine, which is strange because he'd always said that the goal was to take Kiev, not to create a buffer zone in Sumy, Ukraine. But do you see any other signs that morale isn't collapsing in the Russian military as well?
Well, absolutely. First of all, we've gotten used to this constant stream of Russian soldiers making videos saying, we don't get any medical care, we don't have enough food, you're not paying our families. Look, those are acts of mutiny, right? Those aren't just insubordination, that is a mutinous assembly, right? That is a capital offense in any military. We just shrug it off because that's the way the Russian military is. But you look at the daily videos, and there are hundreds of hours published every day. You consistently see things like this. Here's a Russian tank parked somewhere. Every single hatch is open. An armored personnel carried back. Hatches are open, top hatches are open, and the Ukrainians obligingly drop a grenade right down the front hatch. Why do I see this again and again and again? It's because that Russian vehicle crew does not want to fight. They could park that thing in the trees. They could cover it with bushes. That's why you have axes and shovels and everything on an armored vehicle, so you can camouflage it, but they simply don't do it. Artillery pieces parked in front of a bush. Why not tow it into the bush? They don't want to fight that gun. The Russian army is eating its own guts out. Look, those Russian soldiers on the zero line, they know that they are worth nothing to their commanders. They know it and they fight like it. And we're beginning to see an uptick in entire Russian tactical units, mostly the squad level, 10 to 15 guys, surrendering in Kremenna, in Sumy, in Pokrovsk. They've had it. In the Zerbets forest south of Kremenna this week, on 4 occasions, entire Russian rifle squads surrendered intact. They're not being fed. They're not being supported. They don't have food. They don't have water. They don't get medical care. And look, if you don't have bullets, band-aids, and beans, you're not a soldier. You're a homeless person. And they're giving.
Well, they do sort of look like they're pretty ragtag at this point. And in fact, I do see a lot of signs of that. And what's sort of interesting, I think, would be the most indicative signs that there's something going very wrong within Russia is not only that Putin himself behaves bizarrely, truly like he's out of place and he's not sure what's happening, but other little signs. Once again, we don't know exactly what's going on in Moscow. Nobody ever really knows what's going on in the Kremlin. But there's tea leaves, let's say. And there's different tea leaves that we see. We see more and more videos of Russian soldiers surrendering. We see the former Minister of Defense, Shoigu, has disappeared. We see that Putin is, yes, tripping over his words and even his own people, his own Minister of Economics, his own head of the central bank at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, which is a propaganda event to promote the Russian economy. Last week, both those officials said that the Russian economy was in dire straits. And in fact, the head of the central bank said they'd already burnt through the sort of reserves that helped them get through the sanctions initially. At this point, they don't have any more other options. And I don't know if you've seen the data, but it's pretty amazing. Those oil fleets, the shadow fleets, the ghost fleets that are illegally shipping Russia's oil against the sanctions around the world, well, guess what? They have decreased in number by about 70% in just the past few weeks. And the reason is simple. A lot of countries, like India and China, don't want to risk sanctions to the United States. They all seem to think that the U.S. will pass the new sanctions bill in the Senate, which already has 84 co-sponsors of the 100 senators. So it'll pass. And when it does, it'll put a 500% tariff on the goods from countries that continue to buy Russian oil and gas, which means Russian oil might be nice and it might be cheap, but trade for both India and China is substantially more with the United States than with Russia. Russia makes up less than 2% of trade for either India or China. So looking ahead, it seems that Russia has very few options. But my guess is tomorrow, and I've made this argument before, tomorrow, quite literally, the war could end totally unexpectedly. Because if the Russian soldiers realize they're not going to get paid anymore, or if their officers realize our men are going to mutiny, it's time to get out of here ourselves, then that could easily happen when the food stops arriving or the paychecks stop arriving. Things can go totally off track really fast. In 1917, you remember, that's pretty much how the Tsarist military in World War II came to the conclusion that it did. It started killing their officers and running away. It started to create mayhem in the cities when it got back to other parts of Russia. Just between late 1916 and mid 1917, about 2 million Russians just fled. So when you think about this, it could be a very destabilizing event for Russia, which already has tons of men who are fighting the war. They're back in Russia. Many of them still kept arms. Many of them still have grenades. And what do you do with all these men who are not happy? They're not getting paid. They're not getting their veterans benefits. The Russian government can't afford to pay them out. It seems that things could become highly destabilized. But what do you see?
Well, I agree with you completely. And when you have a dictatorial regime, everything is solid and reinforced concrete until the instant it all flies apart. Ask Mr. Ceausescu how fast his world unraveled in 12 hours. Colonel Gaddafi went out to tour the battle line. He wound up getting pulled out of a sewer pipe and torn to pieces. It can change in an instant. And there's this increasing sense, I think, that the Kremlin has. And you and I were talking before the show, and you pointed this out. Look, Shoigu has disappeared for 2 weeks. No one knows where he is. And what effect does that have on the war? I mean, he's completely irrelevant. And I think there was a really interesting moment there in the economic forum. They made sure everyone saw that they were pouring Dom Perignon, but what the head of the national bank said was colder than the champagne. We've burned through our reserves. Wars are expensive. But I have seen this constant uh, negative inflection of Russian combat potential. You can't lose a battalion of men every day in a war and win it. I mean, you can go back to the Trojan War, right? If you're losing 1,000 guys a day, you are not going to achieve your military objective. And I know I've been saying this for a long time, but I mean it with all my heart. Russia cannot defeat Ukraine. Don't forget, they try every morning. The goal is defeat Ukraine and march into Kiev. It's never going to happen, right? Putin said he's in this and he's willing to lose 2 million men. Vlad, old buddy, you're halfway there right now. You are halfway there, and the head of the national bank is telling you you're running out of money. That's a dangerous confluence of events right there, Jason.
Absolutely the case. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that in all cases, like the economy is collapsing, but it's a staged process. Every day it's getting worse. When exactly it's going to collapse, it's not quite clear. But is it going the direction of getting stronger or weaker and weaker and weaker? And the way I've always compared it is like a health report from a doctor for a person that's 123. The health report's never going to say things are getting great. You should go run a marathon. It's the gradual decline. When it's going to finally end, nobody quite knows, but it's going to end. There's no way that they're going to say it's getting better and better. He's healthier than a 20-year-old. It's only going to get worse. The Russian military, like the Russian economy, is in a state of decline. And when it will finally give out and fall apart, it could really happen anytime. Is that what you also see in the military?
I definitely do. We see just the fact that Russia is inducting 30,000 people a month into the military. That just equals precisely the number of people that they lose every month. These guys are arriving from the time that they get tapped on the head and get handed their bonus for joining. 3 days later, 4 days later, they're in combat. There is no training, and they are dying in literally their thousands every day. And we say 1,000 is the benchmark every day, an entire battalion, but they've lost 2,000 in a day. They've lost 2,200 in a day. Some days they lose 900, but most days they lose between 11 and 1,200. And again, I see this death loop: no training, poorly maintained equipment, no logistics. the guys on motorcycles delivering baguettes and bullets under their arm, literally donkeys. And to also remember this, where the Russians do advance, their supply lines get stretched even farther. Not that they're really advancing, right? 400 square kilometers for 60,000 men. It's never going to work out, Jason. It just absolutely is not.
It looks like it's getting worse and worse for the Russians in their economy and their military. And look how nervous Putin is, it seems, their political system. It looks like Russia really is getting closer every day to the brink of finally collapsing. Chuck, it was great talking with you.
Great talking to you, Jason.